So I'd like to hand over in a moment to Chris Gunn, Dr. Chris Gunn from the University of Central Lancashire, and Professor Geoff Walters from the University of Liverpool. And they're going to talk to us about some developments in grassroots governance, or the governance of grassroots organisations. That will be based largely on the research that some of you may have seen went into the SGA essay in sports governance that came out last November. We'll pop a link in the chat if you hadn't had a chance to read that. It'll be well worthwhile taking a look and catching up on more in-depth discussion of today's session from there. But that arises out of Chris's research and the work that he's done with Geoff on that. And in the forward to that essay, we sort of wrote that local grassroots clubs are essentially the lifeblood of sport in this country. They're often the first point of contact that people have with sport from a delivery point of view and also an administrative point of view. And they're sort of uniquely being affected at the moment by a number of changes in their environment and the extent to which what we would consider good governance practices are being carried out. So today we're going to look at the role that voluntary clubs play in the sporting, cultural, social life of the UK, the environment in which they operate, the challenges they face, and some of the responses that we're seeing from a governance point of view. Chris and Geoff will speak for around half an hour or so, leaving plenty of time for Q&A at the end. And as you say, if you could drop any questions in the Q&A, you can also upvote other people's questions. I'll be here sort of marshalling the slide deck, but other than that, I will hand over to Chris and to Geoff.
Thanks, Craig. I'll just wait for the slides to load up. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, fine. Just going to share my screen, which is just can't actually bring the mouse down. Okay, I'm having a little bit of trouble just sharing the screen at the moment.
Do you want me to just briefly start and then we'll go straight onto the?
Yeah, I think should be fine. Oh, this might be the way to do it. Oh, PowerPoint Live. Oh, this is something new.
That's great.
Oh, there we go.
I'll just say something briefly and then Geoff might want to introduce himself. So I'm going to, for transparency, good governance, declare strong personal interest from the outset based on, some of my earliest and happiest memories were based around club sports environments, playing and watching sport. And then since then, became a captain and a coach, took over responsibilities for things like social side, more recently funding, then became vice chair. So strong personal interest in this particular field. Geoff?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I recognise a few names here from the certificate, so it's good to see colleagues here. So some of you do know me. I'm a professor of sport business at the University of Liverpool and colleague of Chris's. I've worked with Chris for a good number of years now. I've sort of come at this from the angle of my research has tended to focus more at the national governing body level. And as we know, there's been a lot of focus around organisational governance within national governing bodies. But what we're seeing and where Chris's research sort of built on from that, he's looking at this within the context of voluntary sports clubs because they are important. They are the lifeblood of the voluntary sector in many ways. And so just trying to understand what it is that's going on within the executive committee level or the board level within voluntary sports clubs is the basis of Chris's PhD, which he and I are subsequently working on research in relation to that. So this is Chris's the findings from Chris's PhD that are all based on his work with the voluntary sports clubs, and hopefully it'll give you some good insights into what they're doing and some good sort of practical ideas for organisational governance within VSCs. So sorry, Chris, I don't know if you were going to say that. I've introduced you in the talk, but anyway, I'll...
You're all right, Geoff. Okay, are we going on to the poll?
So for those of you that haven't used Slido before, if you could scan the QR code using your phone or any kind of device that you've got, that will then load up the question, and then hopefully your answers should start populating on the screen.
And we'll just use this to compare and contrast with some of the literature and some of the research that's come out in recent years.
It's looking like, yeah, volunteers and funding and finance are two of the biggest ones coming up. Just looking at some of the smaller ones as well. Yeah, participation, declining numbers.
I'm from my point of view, I'm one of the areas I'm interested in, particularly in the football industry, is regulation. We all know there's a lot going on at the moment around the independent regulator, but there's two here that have caught my eye. There's quite a few of you have obviously put complying with regulation, but somebody's put no regulation. So there's a direct contrast there, which I think is quite interesting.
Looks like that should be most of them. I think everyone's stopped typing, so I don't know if Chris, if any of those catch your eye.
Yeah, no, certainly. Thanks. Well, I think that provides a really nice sort of start, really, because it seems that a lot of people have managed to capture certainly some of the issues that we'll discuss during the course of the presentation. So, no, I'm just quickly scanning. Okay, so shall we use that as a basis then for the? So what I'm going to touch on first of all is some fairly recent research that's come out from different studies. Are we okay to? Oh, that's great. So this was a piece of work carried out across Dutch clubs, and I'm a bit wary about trying to pronounce that name accurately, but they found that clubs, some in their study, some clubs are doing well, some clubs flourishing, some really struggling, and some effectively ceasing to exist. And this is very similar to earlier work by Nichols, who's worked with a number of authors, and also the SRA, who've done a number of pieces of work over the years, usually every 2 or 3 years. And when I alluded to before my background, I can think of a number of football, cricket, squash, and golf clubs that no longer exist in localities that I lived in when younger. And people like Robson and Eldavas talk about how personal interest and personal observations can be catalysts to real world research, and that's where my interest really sort of started. Was I could see very, very obviously that some clubs seem to be growing and doing well, others were really struggling, and some had closed down. And I wanted to try to identify, well, what is it that some of these clubs that seem to be doing well, what are they doing? And I wanted to look at that through a governance lens, because obviously governance being a really significant topic within sport and growing, increasing in terms of the research that was carried out in that field. But one of the problems that I identified and spoke to Geoff about this quite a long time ago was that there didn't seem a lot of research at grassroots level. There was a lot of work at governing body level, but apart from a little bit of work in New Zealand, there wasn't a lot that specifically and exclusively focused on grassroots governance. And I thought, right, there's a big issue here. So this work that was done by Nichols in terms of clubs and the difficulties, there was some more work done recently by Berge and colleagues into Swiss VSCs, and again found similar kinds of problems and similar issues in terms of some clubs were struggling, and they noticed that numbers of clubs have slightly fallen, but also that in some of these clubs, there was growth of junior members, but they were losing adult members, and there's an obvious implication there and difficulty for the sustainability of that club if they're losing the adults who might carry out some of the administrative tasks. So, and they went on to say that one of their conclusions was the proportion of clubs facing problems that threaten their existence is increasing. So this is not just a UK issue. This is something that's been identified in Europe, in Australia, Canada. There's a lot of research come out of there, so a little bit in America and a little bit in Africa. So it's pretty much, you could argue it's a global issue that, you know, a lot of grassroots clubs face. So my research involved investigation of national and international literature and studies, and then I looked at some case studies of some long-standing and reputable grassroots clubs, and then we'll focus on that as we go through. Are we okay to move on? So that's the aim of the session, basically, is to share some of the insights that came from the study into the difficulties, and as you quite rightly identified, members of the group have already already suggested quite a number of these. So if we focus on that to start with, and the significance of the clubs, and then we'll review governance, and Geoff will talk about that, and then we'll go on to the findings specifically from the primary research. Okay, so in terms of utility and ubiquity, I'll just let you quickly glance through some of that. And as Geoff and Craig have mentioned, that, you know, this does suggest that VSCs are the lifeblood of sporting provision. When you look at the numbers in England or the UK or even across Europe, you get some insight into the breadth and the depth and the quantity. And then some fairly recent work by the SRA and Active Insights Group found that the people who are members of these and the people involved in running these organisations felt that they play a crucial role in their communities. And again, that was brought home even more by some work by the University of Bath, and they were when they were looking at grassroots clubs in Bristol, Manchester, and London, they found that children who were responding to their survey said that the children found gave clubs membership gave them a sense of belonging and emotional connection. So there's definitely an argument to be made about these clubs being the lifeblood of sport provision. And a number of authors, quite a range of authors from right across, you know, a number of countries, have said that VSCs can effect a number of positives or externalities, as they call them. And again, I'll just let you have a quick look at those. So while we've got this argument that there's a number of positives that can emerge from grassroots clubs, I think we also got to recognise that there are some criticisms, and there are also sort of countervailing perspectives. Some authors talk about the potential for VSCs to become dominated by a small, powerful group. Some talk about historically gendered restrictions. Can we not quite can we just go back a fraction, or come on to that one in a second, if that's okay? So Ray Van Plu's done a lot of work on grassroots clubs, talked about exclusivity, social insularity. Fred Coulter's work talks about, you know, clubs being preserved of dominant classes, and various other authors talk about, you know, being closed systems or rather anachronistic in their practices. And then there was some really good work that came out of Australia by Ramon Sparge and colleagues, and they found that even though clubs talked about being diverse and inclusive, when they actually looked into the narratives and the discourse, they actually found that, you know, the opposite was true. So wherever you sit on the spectrum of recognising VSCs, there are lots of positives, but there's also work to be done. And Richard Tacon, one of Geoff's colleagues, talks about VSC has been a highly valuable context, and that was something that, certainly, definitely, I consider very strongly. They're very valuable, but we need to, there's areas we need to address, which is where when I was doing some research and I was looking at criticisms of clubs, I came across various ones. So if we can just have a look at these again. Now, some of these might chime with people, but I'm hoping that, they're no longer quite as prevalent as they were when, a few years ago. But I think we've all heard of these kinds of criticism being levelled at local clubs. And when I talk to clubs, and I've done a lot of work with clubs over the years now, I talk to them and try and encourage them to operate through certain key principles or values, and hopefully, that'll help overcome these issues. So just going to quickly flick through some of the challenges, and you'll see where your responses compare and contrast with the research. So I'm not going to talk about each one of these in depth, but yes, we've mentioned about problems around volunteer attrition, recruitment. And there's some good work by the SRA and people like Seppel and colleagues, and things around losing juniors, but also in that transitional phase to adulthood, but also the amount of administration that is a deterrent to some people becoming members. There was some good work quite a long time ago. I can't remember the author, but basically said that if you get involved in a club, however much you do, people want you to do more, and I certainly see that from a personal perspective. Availability and access for facilities is a major problem, and again, that's not just specific to this country, that's across the board. We've all probably aware of the increasing cost of maintaining facilities and how that impacts on income generation, but also reserves. The professionalisation, formalisation is an interesting one, because some research says that this can help clubs, but then other research says that it creates additional costs and can sometimes prove problematic for different reasons. So there's research that comes at that from slightly different angles. We've also got expectations and increases in expectations from consumers, but links to kind of pressures from market forces and issues around capacity and trying to deal with that. And again, especially if we're working with a mainly volunteer workforce. And then again, you've got various internal, external club contexts. So again, there's been some really good research about how the locality, how the local community, the size of it, the composition of it, the affluence of it can impact on clubs. And one of my concerns is that, and a big concern for me, is that there's certainly strong evidence that the smaller clubs are finding it a real struggle to cope with things like the administration, the professionalisation, all the expectations. And there is some evidence that the larger clubs are growing because they're attracting more investment and income, and the smaller clubs are dying out. Can we move on to the next one? Just going to make a few points about some of these, and this is where we start to talk about perhaps one or two examples of some of the changes that clubs have adopted to try and address this. So in terms of social trends, there's been a global trend that was noticed quite a while ago around a move away from formal team sports and the uptake in more the casual or the individual sports. And this is obviously quite difficult for some of the team VSCs, people preferring more flexible or less formal types of participation. And I've also mentioned about the global trend as to the changes as we see people go through the life cycle, and as they get a bit older and go into that early adult phase, tend to drop out certainly of team environments and team sports. So one of the questions is there anything that we can do to try and encourage the retention of junior members? So some clubs, for example, might have mentoring schemes. Some clubs have some other forms of carrots to try and retain those juniors, so that we're developing an affective relationship rather than just a transactional relationship. In terms of economic, we've talked a bit about that, but also the increasing political intervention, again, right across the board. Sport has been seen as an instrument, a means to tackle various social issues. And again, there's a lot of research on this. And you see examples where a lot of initiatives are tied to tackling certain, so it might be underrepresented groups, for example. And some clubs have got the capacity and the wherewithal and the capabilities to be able to address that. Again, my concern is whether small clubs can offer that to that extent. So an important message that came across in some research was, what can you do to try and retain people in some format so that they might re-engage more fully when their life circumstances change. We've also seen increasing sort of burdens on clubs from a legal perspective, the GDPR, safeguarding, things like caste status, incorporation, employment legislation, taxation. So there's a whole raft of things there that putting pressures on clubs. Technology, can be really helpful for some clubs. There's quite a lot of research again on that, but again, it's quite, there's big resource implications there, and it's a big task to try to manage that on behalf of an organisation and do it in a professional manner. Field pressures, these are things that might come down from leagues or county boards or foundations or governing bodies. And again, you can see the links there with government strategy. But one of the criticisms or complaints when I was doing some research with quite a lot of the clubs that I spoke to in terms of their administrators was the amount of extra work this is creating for them. And that's certainly acting as a deterrent to some volunteers. And obviously then you've got the competition, and it's not just other clubs. It's things like esports, but then you've got other opportunities and other activities that people might undertake rather than playing sport. And again, we've seen some, in things like developments in the private sector and the public sector, where again, voluntary sports clubs are having to compete with those organisations too. And usually they may have more resources to be able to improve their facilities, etc. So giving you sort of just a bit of an idea of some of the difficulties and the problems that either stem from the secondary research or the primary research. Geoff, are you just going to just put everything into the governance framework and context for us?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Cheers, Chris. Okay, so this isn't probably a million miles away from what some of you have heard me speak about at previous sessions on the certificate. But just to sort of bring this all back, Chris has outlined what a lot of the challenges are that voluntary sports clubs face. We saw that right at the start, some of the issues that you all identified in the voluntary sports clubs you either work in or know of. One of over the last sort of 20 years in the UK and more widely in other countries as well, the idea of organisational governance has almost been seen in some ways as a panacea, in the sense that it can, good governance can ensure that organisations are sustainable financially, there's longevity, they can continue to exist. It can sort of, good governance can mean that an organisation can continue to operate and overcome some of the challenges. Now, there's an element of truth in that, absolutely. I think, I'm coming from the perspective where I do believe in the importance of good governance, but I certainly don't see that good governance is the answer to everything, and there are challenges. And this has come out in some of my research with national governing bodies of sport, some of the challenges and issues. And it came out in some of the comments that you all mentioned earlier, the challenges in complying with regulation, for example. That's a governance issue, but that can be difficult. And particularly at the voluntary sports club level, that is a challenge. So, I'll be fairly brief with the next couple of slides, just to give you that context and background. So essentially, when we're talking about organisational governance, we're focusing very much at the level of in this case, the voluntary sports club as the organisation. So it's how the voluntary sports club is controlled. Who are the people responsible for overseeing the direction, the strategy of the voluntary sports club? And how does that work? So that's effectively what organizational governance is, and you can apply this at different types of organizations, whether it's at the corporate sector, whether it's in the public sector, whether it's in the third sector, the non-profit sector. And this idea then of steering governance comes from the Latin word, and again, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, just like Chris can't pronounce Dutch academics, but gubernere, I think it is, which effectively means steering. So that's the idea that, if you think, it's almost that nautical etymology, the idea that, an organization is a ship and the board then are steering the direction of the ship. So that's what organizational governance is about. Next slide, please, Sam. So why is it important? These are the sort of standard reasons why organizational governance is important. So the board, or in many cases the executive committee, depends on, that's the body that's responsible for making decisions and overseeing the particular organisation. So, of course, in a lot of voluntary sports clubs, you don't have a board, you have a committee, for example. So the board or executive committee, they're the key decision-making body. The people on the board are there to oversee the organisation, make decisions in the interest of the organisation, try to ensure that it's accountable to its members, for example, to its wider community, these sorts of issues. The board, or some of the key roles they need to put in place, making sure that there are processes, policies, measures, mechanisms in place to protect the finances. Safeguarding, I saw, was an issue there and has become a more prominent issue within the sports sector over the last 10 years. They're things that, again, the committee needs to have oversight. And risk as well, having a risk register, a risk management system in place. Not to say that you need to be risk averse. A certain level of risk is healthy in an organisation, but you need to understand the nature of those risks and of course, that helps you to inform your decision as to whether to pursue a particular strategy or course of action. And also, as well, we're seeing a lot more recently in the last 5-10 years around the board playing a role in setting the tone or the culture of the organisation. We've seen this at the national governing body level with a whole series of different governing bodies that have faced cultural challenges and behavioural challenges, particularly around the way elite athletes were treated. And of course, this then points back up to the board level saying, well, what was the board doing in overseeing the culture within the organisation? Why were they not on top of this and stopping these sorts of behaviours? So the board itself, or the executive committee, in the case of a lot of voluntary sports clubs, plays a significant role. So it's an important role in an organisation. Final slide. I'm sure you'll all be, or final slide from me, I'm sure you'll all be familiar with the Code of Sports Governance, but this came out in 2016, so we're 9 years in now. This is the second edition, and it's a very straightforward code based on 5 principles with a whole series of recommendations or requirements related to each of those 5 principles that are focused very much at board level and the board's role in overseeing the organisation. So again, this is if any organisation is to receive funding from Sport England or UK Sport, has to adhere to the requirements set out in the code. But what we've seen as well in certain sports is this code has started to filter down to the voluntary sports club level. Particularly, we've seen it in the FA, where the FA have taken this code, adapted this code, and created a county code of governance, which is very much based on these principles. And of course, that applies more at the county level, more towards the grassroots. So you can see how governance as an organisational governance has been a key issue, a prominent issue within the sports sector at the Sport England, UK Sport and national governing body level, but we're starting to see it filter down. It becomes more prominent and more important within voluntary sports clubs. And that's quite an issue, or can be a challenge, because some of the research that Chris has alluded to has shown that in the past, voluntary sports clubs have often, they haven't had, they've not been very strategic, for example. One of the phrases I like is that they're governed in a very kitchen table way. It's a group of people coming around together, they're not particularly strategic, and they're just muddling through. Now, the research that Chris has done has shown that's not necessarily the case, that there is a certain level of professionalism at many voluntary sports clubs. But again, there are differences between those voluntary sports clubs that are a lot larger and maybe have a lot of members and a lot of different sports sports teams, might even be multi-sports clubs compared to perhaps some that are a lot smaller. And I'll just leave you one final quote. I'll put it in the chat. So this comes from Terry Byers is I think she's Australian or New Zealand academic, and she's written a lot. I think she is. She might be English. She's written a lot on voluntary sports clubs, and this came from something she published in 2017 on the CGI website. But Craig, I can't find it anymore. The pages no longer exist, so I don't know if that article now exists online. But anyway, she said sport at elite level. So I'm talking about national governing bodies of sport, is having a detrimental effect on the grassroots, as some of its governance principles and management practices are being pushed upon small community organisations in an attempt to make them more professional, thereby more successful. So it's an interesting, thought-provoking piece where we can say it's easy to stand there and say organisational governance is good. The principles of governance are set out. We need to abide by these. But my argument is that yes, they are important, but they aren't the panacea. And what are some of the unintended consequences that come from trying to push good governance and promote good governance? What are some of the issues that organisations may face when trying to implement these? And that's exactly what Byers is saying at the voluntary sports level. It can be challenging. So yes, this is something that I want us to sort of bear in mind. And I think some of the comments early on, sort of that comes through. When the individual has said difficulty in complying with regulation. What does that mean then in terms of volunteering? Does it put volunteers off, for example, because they think this is too challenging a role for me? I don't have the expertise or skills. It's not what I want to do. It's not why I wanted to get involved with the governance of a voluntary sports club. So these things can be interlinked. Anyway, I have the ability to talk and go talk too long. So I'm gonna bring it to a close there and pass back to Chris.
Geoff, I think you make a really good point, because I do come at this from a local sort of grassroots level, and I am concerned about the pressure and the amount of time. So one person that I was speaking to recently, she said that she does between 2 and 3 hours a night of club admin, and she has a family and she is a full-time job. And I just think is that really sustainable? And at some stage, when will she burn out? And I'm grateful you made that point from Terry Byers, because we're certainly seeing that at grassroots level in terms of sometimes the initiatives, and it can just become overloading. Can we move on to the next one? Because what I'll focus on now is, so I looked at a whole number of clubs, and then I did a more intense focus on 3. And these 3 clubs were very long-standing, all over 100 years old. I looked at them purposely because of their reputation, but also in some instances their achievements, and also the fact that they'd all encountered periods of instability. But that had been addressed, and I was wondering whether it had been addressed through good governance. So it was a kind of, what are you doing? What have you done from a governance angle, from a governance lens, that has enabled you to grow and develop and sustain yourselves? And there were 3, from the primary research data, there were 3 key governance focuses or and sets of practices that were identified. And the clubs were very, very good at communicating, engaging with stakeholders in a whole range of formal and informal means and manners. And that was very clear that they had a very sort of stakeholder-centric perspective, and that was underpinned by the democratic and transparent and accountable values. So again, I was quite impressed with that. There was also a really strong focus, and we'll see where this plays out in a minute or two with the model, around trying to make sure that they addressed financial and facility issues within their clubs. And another thing that came out really strongly, which was a little bit less expected, was the extent to which they reviewed and planned for the future, but reviewed things like performance. And it wasn't just sporting performance, but it was like business performance. And that came out very strongly from the research. So what I then did was looked at all these practices and then tried to develop a mnemonic, a model that encapsulated these, and that formed the basis of what's since become like the 7 F's framework. Now you'll be able to guess at some of these, because they've already appeared in today, and they've appeared in a lot of the literature. I'm just going to take some of these and just give you a bit of an insight. So in terms of finances, the clubs that I investigated were careful. They adopted professional accounting practices. They ensured regulatory and financial compliance. And as I said, strong evidence of being transparent and accountable in terms of, listening to members and responding to them about queries in relation to, the financial matters. They constantly monitor their financial position, and they tried to ensure that they had a kind of healthy reserve. And this was helped by the fact that all the clubs had these qualified accountants on their boards or executive committees. But the other thing that came out as well was the fact that they'd adopted a really proactive approach in terms of fundraising. They looked at, diversifying their incomes. They looked at new programs and new cohorts and new ideas. They were receptive, which I'll come on to again in a bit. They were, and in terms of fundraising, there was a mix of the traditional kind of social events, but there was also new ventures that they looked at. And there's a lot of reference in the research to, how funding to some extent is reduced for some organisations, especially, some postcodes, and increased competition for it. But these clubs had sort of been very proactive in how they tried to bring in incomes, and part of that was through what I called facing outwards. So some criticisms of clubs in the past has been that they've been a bit a bit insular and a bit parochial, but these clubs had certainly started to recognise that that's really not the way forward. Yes, they managed to acquire new sponsors, but they'd also collaborated with other organisations. They developed partnerships. There's a whole body of literature, inter-organisational collaboration or inter-organisational relationships, and some of it does come with dangers and difficulties. But the case studies I looked at had developed good positive relationships with, for example, local councillors or local schools, and their leagues or their governing bodies, and they developed this positive public reputation and profile within their communities. So that and something else that was very, very evident through the observations and through the interviews was the constant updating and investment in facilities. Now, going back to some of the secondary research, it says developments and improvements can generate excitement or drive satisfaction and attract other members. And again, that was something that these clubs seem to have recognised. And it wasn't just about investing in their playing facilities, but they also had invested in things like their social or their spectating facilities, and recognised how all of these can have an impact. This something else that I've already mentioned on a previous slide. I called it, because I wanted to develop a model that was reasonably easy to remember, this future focus. And all the clubs that I'd looked at had developed a pretty much a strong kind of a strong kind of calendar of activities and events, but they were looking at, what do they need to do in the future? They were looking at developing their strategies, and I'll come on to an example in a minute. But there was this continuing focus on, the strategic aspect and not just the operational. Something that, in terms of that encapsulated the ethos as well, was the focus on fun. They tried to make sure that they were, looking at it from a family perspective and not just, a rather sort of narrow playing perspective, and thinking about the players, trying to make sure that, there's opportunity to develop friendships. And this again is fully supported in the secondary research. Boozer et al., which was only published last few weeks, says that problems with member recruitment and retention are perceived less in clubs with a culture of conviviality and trusting relations, and part of that stems from a strong social calendar and a range of sort of opportunities to develop friendships. The last bit really was, and I think this encapsulated some of the activities that I've already mentioned, is the fact that the clubs were facilitative. They were listening to the members, but they were also flexible in their approach. They were taking on new ideas. They might have new formats. They might have activities that were targeting different demographics. So they were open to those kind of ideas. And Stenling did some good work in Sweden a few years ago, where she identified that a lot of adolescents didn't want the really rigid formal types of sporting participation. They wanted something that was a bit more social and a bit more enjoyable, and not just all about developing yourself as a sports person, but gave more of the adolescents that she interviewed chance to develop friendships. So the next slide just basically sums up these 7 Fs and how I define them. And there was the evidence from the impact of these types of approaches and these changes in practices and enable these clubs to become more financially solid. Now, that was a word that all of them used, and these were all accountants, and they talked about the solidity of their organisation compared to the lack of it in the past or in previous some clubs talked about it in early 2000, late 90s, and the early second decade of the 21st century. And I also did focus groups with members, and it was obvious that a lot of the members were really appreciative of the efforts of their boards or the executive committees in terms of being responsive, but also improving facilities. So it was quite interesting how, when you speak to committee members, they can give you one line, but the members were supportive. Members were appreciative, and a lot of the gripes were really minor. So in terms of from that research, then I worked closely with one of the case studies, and I did some focus groups again with members and a survey, and then helped them develop a strategic plan. And this is where you start to see the Fs go into a more formal structure. So those sort of 7 Fs framework, if we just move on to the strategic plan, I'll outline a couple of points from that. So, and you might see from this, there's quite a lot of work went into this, but the strategic plan had 6 areas of strategic focus, and sport was only one of them. So this was a multi-sport club, and they had, they wanted to be a successful multi-sport club, but they also recognised that as part of that, they needed to have a focus on facilities, try to produce, top class playing and practice facilities, and provide good changing facilities and good spectating facilities. But there's a social aspect, and there's a book by Light and Davis who talk about how important the social aspect is to sports clubs, grassroots sports clubs. And again, that's been that book. There's been the comments in that book have been replicated in a whole range of research right across a number of countries about the importance of having that really vibrant social scene. So there's a calendar of social events, for example, that runs right through the year. The commercial and the financial, the page 2 breaks these broader aims down into more measurable objectives. Is obviously something I've already mentioned, but there's also the reputation aspect. And if you've got a strong reputation, the argument is if you've got a positive reputation, that can crowd in other funding and other income streams, and show that you're a progressive organisation. And finally, the reference to some aspects of the governance side of things in terms of the structure of the organisation. And now I'm helping this club through incorporation, which will be achieved around about September, October this year. And again, there's a lot of work involved, but that's evidence of how the club is taking on new practices and looking at governance from a different lens. So overall, I'm hoping you can get an insight into the fact that a lot of these clubs are a little bit more formalized and a bit more professionalized, I realize, but we are talking about reasonable, pretty decent sized clubs here. One had over 250 members, one had well over 400, around about 450, and one had over 1,000. So they are larger than most, quite a few of the UK clubs. You can get some enormous voluntary sports clubs in Europe, but in terms of UK, these tend to be, on the slightly larger side. I want to finish with something that is really, really, for me, really important. a few years ago, a guy called Ray Oldenburg, an American sociologist, was writing about something called the third place. And typically the first place might be your home, and your second place might be work or your education, some places that you spend a lot of time. He talks about third places and how important these are to civic society and how important they are for people. And third places are the places where people can go and relax, and they can feel welcomed, and they can feel at home in the sense of that they're valued. And places where they might involve sport, but it's just conversation and friendships. And something for me is that I think that if sports clubs are going to thrive and survive, apart from the fact they're going to need to adapt to the really challenging environment, but I think we need to accept people and see them as individuals, and not judge them on the ability or their value as sports people, but see them as an end in themselves. And that was one of the criticisms of Ram Sparge and colleagues' work, in that some of these Australian VSCs were just looking at people purely from an athletic perspective and judging them. And if we can provide a safe, warm, friendly haven away from some of the more harsh or stressful realities occurring beyond our clubhouses or grounds, and provide opportunities for friendship and fun and enjoyment, then I think it's more likely we're going to develop this affective relationship where where trust and loyalty are engendered, and therefore more likely to hopefully keep members happy. And some recent research from neuroscience has said, how important, and we all know this, but this was just slightly different for me, this one. Social interaction, yeah, it's really good for our brain and our health. But the bit that chimed with me was that those who participate in positive social interactions or experience, good social relationships, they're not only ill less often than those who are alone and isolated, but they're also more likely to fight off serious illness. And there was some research that came out from America a bit ago, again, about how membership of sports clubs can be really positive for people's mental health. And we know about the difficulties of isolation. So for me, then, sport can provide lasting friendships and memories. And one of my roles is to try and help sports clubs try to move forward and help them engage with this difficult environment. And hopefully, by adopting good governance practices, that will enable a lot of clubs to survive and thrive and continue providing that positive impact in their communities. So that's it from me. Thanks very much, everyone, and not too long for questions. So sorry about that, Craig.
No. Thanks a lot, Chris, and thank you, Geoff. I think we've got at least 10 minutes for questions, and I can see that a number have come in the Q&A. If we don't get through them in that 10 minutes, I think certainly everyone on this side of the call is happy to stay on a little bit beyond 12. So we will continue with the recording, and if you do want to jump off, you'll be able to catch up on any Q&A. I'm just scanning through the questions, Chris, and I think there's a couple, I think, around certainly the environment in which clubs operate in this country at the moment. So maybe you can take two together. And that's one, that there's an observation that the multi-sport or the shared facilities model is perhaps less prevalent in the UK as opposed to other countries in Europe, for example. Do you have any thoughts on that? And then there's one that you've presumably come across in terms of the pressures that the clubs are facing for engagement, and that's around technology and smartphones in particular, that are keeping people away from sport and occupied in other ways. So any sort of reflections on those developments, and perhaps we could also roll into that the cost of living situation that people are facing, how in your research you found that's impacting on participation and the sort of business prospects for sports clubs.
There's a lot there, Craig. I'll try and take these in order. Multi-sports clubs, yes, more common certainly in Europe. Tradition of more single sports in this country. I think there's a trend to moving towards. I think there's certainly seen trends of things like amalgamation and partnerships developing where one club might own facilities and have social facilities, and other clubs will then partner up and ask if they can use those or become part of that club. So I think there is a move. I think the bigger clubs are getting bigger in some respects, and they've got the capacity perhaps, and the sort of human capacity to enable them to grow a bit. So I think that's a trend that I think we'll see a bit more of, and I do worry about the smaller clubs and the pressures on them. The pressure, you said something about pressures of engagement.
Yeah, so essentially I guess it's the other claims on people's attention and spare time and leisure time that technology, and I suppose the person asking the question mentions phones in particular. I guess you could extend that to gaming consoles and things that keep them in their bedrooms rather than in sports clubs.
So I think like anything, there's so much competition for people's time and money and volunteering. Every time you walk past any charity shop, there's a sign outside saying, donate with us, work with us, volunteer with us, etc. So there's all sorts of pressure. I think clubs need to be like the clubs that I looked at. The clubs need to be proactive and market themselves, and certainly sell their strengths, and playing to their strengths, and perhaps using some of the research in terms of how there's a really good piece. There's some good work that came out of Surrey University from SEPTA, the Centre for Education. They talked about life-wide learning, where people can learn in certain environments and apply that learning to others. And I think that's something that, right back on about the second or third slide, it talks about how clubs can help personal development, help people from whether it's their mental health, physical health, help them develop a whole range of skills that then are applicable to other areas. So I think there's some work to be done by clubs in terms of trying to recognise what are their strengths, what can they provide, what can they deliver, and making sure that the communities in which they operate are aware of these. And so I think there's definitely a need for that, and perhaps clubs to be a bit more perhaps proactive, like the ones that I looked at are very much. And then the other thing that I just picked up on was some clubs have been very creative in developing different types of memberships, so that rather than, and you see this particularly in golf, for example, that have adapted quite a lot. So rather than just having kind of certain types of membership that can be quite expensive and therefore a deterrent, do adopting more flexible forms of membership. And I think that that and therefore cheaper in some respects. And some clubs are also enabling their members to become qualified, so they'll put them through coaching courses, or they'll give them opportunities to develop some volunteering experience at quite a young age. And whether it's links to what they're doing at school, and they give them some hours to accredit them towards courses, etc. So I think it's about recognizing that trying to appeal to different demographics and different groups, and giving them some kinds of positive experiences that then enable that those people to be retained as members or to be attracted.
Can I just pick up on that? And it's also picking up on one of the comments in the chat by thanks Lindsay for that, and also thanks for the link to the document in Sport England that you've co-authored with Geoff Nichols and others around innovation, because that's what Chris is essentially saying, that some of the voluntary sports clubs have been quite innovative in the way they've been thinking about the membership or other aspects, particularly on the commercial side and driving income. There's a lot of innovation going on there, but at the same time, what you could argue a lot of these innovations are happening because there's a certain level of stability. These voluntary sports clubs exist for their membership, they exist for a social purpose, they exist for us to provide sporting opportunities. So that aspect of the voluntary sports club doesn't change. It's there in perpetuity. It's the reason for the voluntary sports club to exist. So there's a long history of stability around those aspects, but in order to preserve those aspects, voluntary sports clubs are having to think innovatively around the finances, around the commercial side, and so it's both a sort of a paradox in that there's stability, but at the same time change is happening as well, and I think that ties in. I'll have a look at what you've sent through around innovation, Lindsay, because I think that's that's absolutely critical to a lot of these voluntary sports clubs.
Just picking up another couple of questions, trying to group them sort of thematically. We've got a couple that are looking here at the sort of this question from an NGB perspective. One relatively broad question, which would be, I think, extremely useful to anyone to have the correct answer for, which is what is if you're starting from ground zero, what is the best way to develop good governance for clubs without overburdening the clubs? And then perhaps something related to the burden or otherwise is there something that the NGBs could do in terms of creating a volunteering resource bucket, as the questioner calls it, which clubs could dip into? This could be internships, apprenticeships, for example, so that the NGBs essentially can help facilitate good governance at club level. So what can clubs do, starting from scratch, I guess, and is there anything that NGBs can do to support their clubs?
There is, as somebody's mentioned in the chat, I've not really been monitoring the chat, to be honest, but somebody's mentioned in the chat Buddle, which was which I think arose from the ashes of Club Matters, which there's some resources on there in terms of I'm not fully up to speed with what's on there right at this moment in time, but a bit ago there was definitely quite a lot of useful information around club constitutions and club structures and things like that. In terms of from scratch, wow. So thinking that key for me is to establish what's the object of the organisation, what's it really trying to achieve, what's it there for, what's its mission, and then from that there's a whole range, if you look online, of sort of templates for constitutions, and it depends what kind of organisation it is, and multi-sport or single sport, and to what extent is it going to incorporate, is it going to remain unincorporated, is it got a charitable aspect to it? So the particular structure, I think, informs that, but there are some templates around constitutions that you can look at and use as a starting point, and then adapt and amend those as appropriate. But I think going back to the good governance, the basic values of democratic involvement, stakeholder involvement, transparency, accountability, etc. These are a really good starting point, because I think if you base it, I think it's the difference between like case law and common law, isn't it? If you can start off and you can think, we've got a really good constitution here, but can it provide for every eventuality? And if you try to, it'll end up being 40, 50, 60 pages. I think if you go back to the principles and say, what are the foundational principles upon which we want to operate, and use those as a guide, and then you can look at how you try to enact those within the structures and the processes that you adopt. But I mean, you could, that's a massive question, but I don't. Yeah. Geoff, what do you think about that one?
I mean, my thoughts on that one are, there's a lot of governance principles out there. The Code of Sports Governance is one set of principles, but there are codes of sports governance across different countries. We see at the IOC level, you've got the basic principles or international principles for good governance. So there's a whole range of different principles around governance. And I know there was an article in 2023 done by some academics from Canada that basically reviewed a whole set of different governance codes of governance and principles of governance, and I think they found something like over 250 different principles of governance. So you can see that this is a very it's a confusing space in many ways, because if you're starting from scratch and you're saying, right, let's say you don't know much about governance, how do we design governance structures and processes that can help our voluntary sports club? So my argument would be is, firstly, look at structures of governance, and here I'm talking around the sort of the composition of the board, the structures of the board, because if you get structures right, that's the first step on in being able to then demonstrate good governance, and hopefully some of the processes, which I'll talk about in a minute, will flow from that. But structures are important. Don't have a board with 6 men, all age 60 plus, for example. All these very basics, which we're all aware of. Have a diverse board. Make sure you've got people on that board or committee, with a range of experience and skills that will benefit the organisation, relating to what Chris said around the mission of the organisation. And then once you've got those structures in place, I always think of the structures as the sort of the skeleton of the organisation. You can then start to think about the processes and the principles. Now, as I mentioned, lots and lots of different principles. But what the research has shown is there are 3 overarching principles that are pretty much common in every single governance code, and that's transparency, accountability, and democracy. So if you take those as a starting block, how do you implement them through your at the governance level, and how does the board then influence them, or the committee implement them within the voluntary sports club? If you can sort of stick to those transparency, accountability, and democracy, I don't think they're important processes, and I think that they're critical to sort of starting from scratch. But yeah, they would be my immediate reaction to that particular question. On the question of the resource bucket, sounds interesting. I haven't got I think how it would be implemented, I don't know, but it sounds an interesting question.
Okay. Thanks, Chris and Geoff. I think we've got another couple of questions that I think we will try and cover off. So if you are able to stay with us, please do. But for those that do need to jump off, just firstly, thank you for taking the time to join us today. And secondly, just a quick announcement that the SGA's Board Development Fund, so where you can access bespoke in-house training, will be launching that application window next week. And we'll be to help you get to grips with your application. We'll be running a couple of webinars later this month. So on the 13th of March at 11 in the morning, on the 17th of March in the evening. So hopefully, if you're tied up during the day, you'll be able to join that just as a drop-in session to come and talk through how you might want to fill out those applications. So please keep an eye on our comms over the next week or so for details on how to access that fund and get some training for your boards. So thank you. If you do need to jump off, please do jump off. But for those who'd like to stay, I'm just picking through some more of these questions. There were
just before we go on to the question, Craig, someone in the chat has just asked about what the paper regarding the I think it was 250 principles of good governance, and they've also popped one in there as well.
I'm on it, Sam. I'll put the link in the chat. It might be behind a paywall, but if you go onto Google Scholar, you might be able to get it. So I'll pop it in the link into it.
It might be on ResearchGate.
Sorry, Craig. Far away.
Yep. Yeah, no problem. Here's one. That'll be useful to know. I guess people charged with the governance of their organizations, large or small, often worried about the compatibility of different frameworks. So there's a question here as to, do you see your 7Fs framework, Chris, as broadly compatible with the, say, tier 1, so the lower end in terms of the depth of requirements of the Code for Sports Governance?
Yeah, it's really interesting that, because when I was doing the research, the clubs and those people on committees and position of power, etc., they didn't have very much knowledge of the code of governance in its kind of current form. But what they did have really strong knowledge of was how to govern, and how to govern through democratic sort of means, how to govern through being responsive to the members, how to govern through being accountable and transparent in practices. So and I think part of that came from their professional backgrounds and professional experiences. So whereas they weren't fully up to speed with sport governance, they were very, very conscious of trying to make sure they were well governed, and I think that's partly why there was such positive feedback from the members about those particular organisations. As I said, there were gripes, but they were only very minor gripes, rather than going back to those criticisms that were levelled, that I put on that slide earlier on. So I think the 7Fs certainly, that in some respects is compatible, but when I looked at the code of governance and I kind of cross-referenced it with what these clubs were doing, the case study clubs, they were ticking all the boxes. The one area that they wouldn't perhaps have ticked, and this is always my concern for smaller clubs or grassroots clubs, is the issue around sort of like length of tenure. So whereas good governance says, yeah, you need to diversify and you need to bring in new blood. Yeah, all the clubs were doing that, but they had people on their committees that had been on there 20 or 30 years, and that was because it might have been a treasurer, or it might have been somebody who started off in one role and then moved to another role and then became chair. So they did tick all the boxes. But in terms of, if you were to be really strict about saying that people can only fill roles and should only be on committees for 4 years or 8 years, they might potentially fall foul. But they ticked all the other boxes of that tier, yes.
Yeah, I think the sort of term limits, I think that's more rigidly applied to maybe perhaps the larger organisations. Yeah. I think there's a recognition that at sort of at the level we're talking about today, sometimes if you've got a good bunch of people, it's all you could do to keep hold of them without sort of worrying unduly about replacing them for the sake of replacing them. So, but yeah, where you can sort of keep a constant turnover of ideas and personnel and meeting the strategic needs of the committee and of the club, I think by all means, please do that. But perhaps there is a recognition that for some of the reasons we've discussed already, the volunteer positions are hard to fill sometimes. Again, thinking about the resourcing point, and I think the questioner is still on the call, so hopefully we can get an answer to this. Have you given any thought, or have you seen any thought given to helping smaller clubs form federations or become offshoots of larger clubs, essentially to gain economy of scale and thereby have access to a wider group of advisors as suggested, but I guess resources more broadly?
Yes, I've seen some evidence of that, but have you seen any of that, Geoff? I've definitely seen some evidence of that.
I haven't, but it's an interesting point. I mean, you can see. I know certainly it happens with at a bigger scale with universities, how they group together to then to buy in various resources and stuff, because of course if you've got 5 or 6 universities all coming in together, you can then get economies of scale on certain things. So yeah, I mean it would be an interesting one at the voluntary sports club level, and whether it's feasible. Maybe it's one that would work more for those larger clubs, I don't know, that have clubhouses that buy in goods there, and maybe that can help from that perspective. I don't know, or sharing certain other aspects. I don't know.
I think it's something that is definitely happening, but I think it's partly triggered by the leagues. So the boards that manage or govern the leagues in terms of competition structures, they are pushing for closer collaboration and for to operate as a bit of a kind of cooperative or a bit of a collective. So there's some of that, but there's definitely some research that there's more sharing of facilities and clubs being a bit more open to that. I'm just thinking of an example where 1 or 2 clubs have joined up with the slightly larger club in that locality, but I'm not seeing huge evidence of it, but I've certainly seen some evidence of it.
Okay, I think the questioner has raised a hand. Maybe you want to come back and ask a follow-on question or comment on that response.
Yeah, hi. It's me. The only reason I'm asking that is because I live in the largest non-coastal county in the country, which is very rural and fairly sparsely populated compared to the southeast, and it seems to be working quite well in some of our areas. Within some of the smaller towns and things, they actually do have these multi-style sports clubs stroke social clubs, and that seems to work really, really well, and it seems to tie in with this sort of arrangement, I think.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Sarah. I'm glad you were still on the call to receive that response. I think we've pulled out most of the questions that I can see. I can also see in the chat someone's trying to get hold of that the paper that Geoff mentioned by Terry Byers. I think if it's the one that I'm thinking of,
I'm just responding to it, Craig. Yeah,
I think that was on the CGI website, and more particularly, it was on the trade magazine or the member magazine that we have within the CGI website, which was updated. The website was updated relatively easily. So I'll try and dig that out and make it available some other way via the SGA.
Thanks, Craig.
I'm not spotting anything that we haven't covered off in the Q&A. So I think, yes, I see somebody, an observation rather than a question, that sports clubs have an unnatural fascination with having their own facilities. Is that something that you've come across, Chris and Geoff?
Oh, it's just, I think it's
if they ever get their hands on that facility, they're reluctant to go back to the other 7Fs by the looks of this comment.
So, go on. I didn't. Sorry, I just missed.
Sorry. I'll just read the question now. Voluntary clubs have an unnatural fascination with having or owning their own facility, and that overrides everything else. If is capitalized, if they get that facility, they never seem to go back to the Fs. Is that observations borne out in your work?
They never seem to go back to the Fs. Not quite. Is that what? I can't see the question, but yeah. I think a lot of it just stems from the history or traditions of the club. So if they've been fortunate enough to somehow have inherited or been bequeathed or own the land or whatever, or own the facilities, then are you going to want to sacrifice that, because that gives you some security and a further reason to continue existence. And there is some research that those clubs who own their own facilities do tend to last longer. So, but
perhaps also on that, I mean, it's one of the things that maybe we haven't made as clear from this, but I mean, we've got the 7Fs framework that Chris has developed from his research, but all those factors seem to, well, they are interlinked in many ways. So yes, there's the facility side of it, but once you've got the facilities, you can address the families, the friendship, the fun aspect. The finance comes into that, because the facility allows you to then, you can think about innovative ways or creative ways of using that facility to try to raise money. I mean, in where I live in the Northwest, my local cricket club has an event every single Friday, where it's having events for different community groups in the area. So last week I went to one. It was raising money for the women's cricket team. I think this coming week it's for the local bowling club, and it's a way of generating money, because of course money goes behind the bar. So there's a roundabout way of me saying all these 7Fs, they're quite interlinked, but maybe the point is that you need to sort of be quite explicit and bring these out in the conversations that committees have, and think through how do we address these different points and make sure that we've got an overarching strategy that is allowing us to address the key issues that we need to address through those 7Fs, I think. But yeah, it might be the case. I couldn't see the question either, but it might be the case in some places. Some clubs are just very, very overly focused on facilities. I don't know.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, guys. I think we've done all we can do on the Q&A. I know we got half an eye on lunchtime already. So just want to say again, thank you to everyone who's joined us this morning, who's popped questions into the chat or into the Q&A. Hopefully we've answered those questions. Hopefully we've given you something to think about. We will, of course, follow up with the usual feedback forms and requests for suggestions as to topics that you'd like us to cover in future webinars. We want to put out more and more of these kinds of sessions, so please gives a steer on what would be useful and or interesting to you. And finally, a massive thanks to Chris and to Geoff for all your work in putting this together, for the essay that I hope people, if they haven't read already, they'll go away and give a look at. So thank you both for a really interesting, really informative session, and I will catch up with everyone soon. Thanks everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks, Craig. Thanks, Sam.